In the book of John 14, verse 12, Jesus said, "Greater works than these shall we do." Indeed, we are seeing greater works in our time, in our generation, through the man of God, Prophet Emmanuel Makandiwa, as he ministers healing and deliverance. The conception of a human life is a complex and mysterious process. Though medical science has made some advances in studying and understanding the process of creating a life, our ability as humans to influence this process is still extremely limited. The prospect of pregnancy and motherhood is something that many women aspire to. They find joy and fulfillment in giving life to another being, but sometimes things go wrong.
My name is Laina Muneno. I was pregnant, and my pregnancy was a very difficult one. The problem started at 4 months as the pregnancy was just beginning to show. One day as I was sweeping the house and as I picked the broom, I began to feel dizzy and I fell. My husband was away at that time. When he came back, I was feeling worse. I was dizzy and I was experiencing pain in my lower abdomen and my back. I was crying as I held my back. I felt like I was having labor contractions. My husband asked me what was wrong. I told him I didn't know. I just started feeling ill in the morning and I felt heavy contractions as if something wanted to come out. He suggested we go see a doctor. We ended up going to the local clinic. When we got there, they just gave me paracetamol and said they could not see anything wrong with me. They said it was normal to experience pain during pregnancy. I told them this pain was abnormal. This was not my first pregnancy, and the pain was unlike what I had experienced during my first pregnancy. They said, "We'll just give you paracetamol. Maybe you are expecting a boy." Boys usually result in difficult pregnancies. I went back home, and after a week, the pain returned. This would happen after every week, and the pain persisted. It was so difficult. I really didn't know what to do. I began to worry that if I kept complaining about the pain, my husband would begin to think I was exaggerating. I had to ask him to cook and to find someone to help me with the laundry. So we had to pay someone to help me with the laundry because I could no longer do it. Cleaning was difficult. The house would always be dirty. The situation had become impossible. At 6 months, I started draining amniotic fluid. I woke up one night needing the toilet. When I got there, I saw that my waters had broke. I was shocked that this was happening at 6 months. Immediately, I started to experience pain in my abdomen and my lower back. My mother and I debated over what we should do. If I went to the clinic, I wasn't sure what they would say since my waters had broke. Maybe they would say I was in labor. It was possible that I had miscalculated my months. So we went. When we got there, they said, "Well, if your water has broken, it means you're about to go into labor. So we will examine you." They examined me and found that I had not even dilated. They looked at the fetus and said it had not developed fully yet. I still had a few more months to go. They referred me to a hospital. When I got to the hospital, they diagnosed me with a condition called PROM. They said I would have to be admitted for a few days so that they could examine me. They would also need to do a scan to determine whether the amniotic fluid left was enough to sustain the child. If it wasn't, they would have to perform an operation.
From what Mrs. Muneno has said, this was not her first pregnancy, and what she was experiencing was quite unusual. What was happening to her, and what exactly is PROM? What implications did it bear for Mrs. Muneno and her baby? Let us hear from the medical expert.
This lady suffered from a condition called premature rupture of membranes. This is a condition whereby the membranes or the waters break, and a woman who is expecting starts to drain what we call amniotic fluid, or the waters which surround the baby. And they start draining prematurely. And by prematurely, we are talking of before 36 weeks. And by preterm, we are also talking of that same period. But for this lady in question, she started draining at 27, 28 weeks. So it was very, very preterm, the rupture of the membranes. And this amniotic fluid, as I will demonstrate to you on this chart. This is the baby in the mother's womb. This is the placenta here. This is the umbilical cord. Now you see between the baby and the wall of the uterus or the womb, there is fluid which is there, which we call amniotic fluid. And the baby is literally swimming or bathing in this fluid until the duration of the labor. And this fluid has got a lot of functions. Number one, it helps with uniform growth of the body parts of the baby and the organs. And it also assists with the proper development of the bones and the muscles. And it allows the baby to move inside the mother's womb. Because this baby has got hands and feet, and they are supposed to move. Imagine you are sleeping and you are just in one position. It's not comfortable. And that same thing is also not comfortable for the baby either, to just lie in one position. So the baby turns, the baby moves his hands and his feet. So the fluid will help with that. There's a funny thing, when the baby is in the mother's womb, the baby also breathes. Though that breathing is not the breathing which is sustaining his life. We know that he's getting oxygen from the placenta. But the baby will inhale this amniotic fluid through the nostrils, and that fluid will go to the lungs and help the lungs mature. And also some of the fluid, the baby will be drinking the fluid. Okay? And when the baby drinks the fluid, the baby will also be urinating. It's funny how God does it. Will be also urinating into that fluid. Okay? It's so amazing how God does it. As the baby will be drinking this fluid, it helps the digestive process of the baby to mature, the intestines and the bowels to mature. And it also helps maintain a constant body temperature for the baby while the baby is in its mother's womb. And it even helps during delivery. The baby will just glide its way out during delivery because of this fluid. So, it's very amazing how God has done it. And you can imagine for this mother, this fluid was draining slowly, and it was draining and draining and draining. And if you are to look at the image of the mother, this height, what we call fundal height, or the size of the tummy, didn't really correlate with the duration of the pregnancy. And it was because she had drained a lot of this amniotic fluid, and there was very little left to sustain the baby's function. And we know that from medical science, the most common cause of this condition is infection. From whatever cause, infections can cause preterm, premature rupture of membranes. And there are a number of complications are surrounded or associated with this condition. The complication, which is the most feared one, there is a likelihood that she will go into labor within a week of the rupture of the membranes. So the moment a woman ruptures the membrane, no matter what time it is after 26 or 28 weeks, in the hospital we have to prepare to receive the baby. There are certain measures which are done to receive the baby within that 1 week. The other things which can happen is the cord of the baby, which connects the baby to the mother or to the placenta, called the umbilical cord, it can be compressed by this condition. And while the baby is in utero or in the mother's womb, the cord is the lifeline of the baby. So this condition can compress the umbilical cord, and this can starve the baby of the nutrition which is coming from the mother. And also the waste products which are coming from the mother back to the baby cannot be excreted or cannot be drained because the cord is now compressed. Another feared complication of this condition is the placenta can now begin to start separating from the wall of the uterus. And we call it in medical term placental abruption. And this is a very deadly condition. That space between the placenta and the baby becomes occupied by blood or a blood clot. And the mother can actually bleed to death. So this is a very, very fatal condition which a lot of obstetricians fear most. Another complication is the infection can progress. And it no longer becomes just an infection in the pelvis. It can become what we call a systemic infection involving the whole body. So this is what this woman faced.
From a medical point of view, Mrs. Munemo's condition was potentially fatal. Not only was she critically ill, the life of her baby was also at stake. The baby was at risk of being malnourished, underweight, or deformed. Given the current situation, this child's chances of survival were slim. But Mrs. Muneno was not the only one affected by this condition. How did this condition affect those close to her?
It was a difficult time. My wife could not cook, clean, or do laundry. She would constantly complain that she was in pain. There was no peace in our home and there was no rest. My job involves a lot of traveling. As the breadwinner, I had to work, but I could no longer afford to travel due to my wife's condition. It felt like I was the one carrying the pregnancy because I was heavily burdened. I didn't know what to do. My in-laws eventually noticed that I was failing to cope. They suggested that I take her to their home so that they could help me look after her. Whilst she was there, I remember at one point she was 6 months along and I got a call around 2:30 a.m. that her amniotic fluid was draining again. I traveled all the way from our home in Glenview to Ashton Park, where she was. I was wide awake the whole night, afraid of what could happen. At one point I thought, God, is it not better to lose the baby and save my wife's life? I wasn't sure whether this baby would live or whether I would lose both my wife and the baby. One day at the hospital I cried. We say that men don't cry, but I cried and said, God, please preserve my wife's life. She is all that I have right now. Please preserve the life of my wife, the mother of my first child. This was a second pregnancy, and during the first pregnancy, we never experienced anything like this. Even our neighbors knew that something was wrong because they would constantly see us carrying my wife to the hospital. Yet there was no baby when we returned. The next day they would see my mother-in-law at her house. The next my father-in-law. The next day my brother-in-law. There was so much confusion and commotion. We could not make sense of what was happening. She would experience labor pain, but no baby would come. It became an issue. I prefer to call it an issue. It became an issue in my household. I had no peace and no rest. My wife was constantly complaining of pain in her lower abdomen. The doctors said it was labor pain, but I could no longer understand how one could experience labor pains at only 6 months of pregnancy.
Distressed to the point of tears, Mr. Muneno feared he could lose both his wife and baby at any second. Mrs. Munemo's condition persisted in spite of the various medical treatments she received. The antibiotics which should have cured the infection proved ineffective, and Mrs. Munemo's condition worsened. Gradually, she lost more and more of the vital amniotic fluid. So what did this mean for Mrs. Muneno and her baby? What was happening inside her?
Special Miracles will be right back.